Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, part 4 of our analysis of World War I and World War II. I'm joined as always by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back.
Great to be here with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, where we left off last time, we were starting to discuss the events running up to World War II. We had looked at World War I, the disastrous consequences, the utter failure of its mission to make the world safe for democracy, and for the war that was going to end all wars. And the American people were absolutely disgusted. I mean, they knew that this intervention, that it was really contrary to the founding principles of non-intervention of the United States, had resulted in a total waste of American life. I mean, tens of thousands of soldiers had died for nothing, and they knew that Europe was still ridden with strife and conflict. The Treaty of Versailles didn't turn out to be the big, just, moral settlement of the war, and there were still resentments that were seething beneath the surface, especially by Germany. Most everyone was acknowledging that the treaty was totally unfair, and that if it wasn't revised, there were going to be some very bad consequences. Well, those bad consequences started developing well, they were developing the whole time, but definitely in the 1930s when the Nazis took over, with Hitler seizing on many of the provisions in the Treaty of Versailles to stir up people's emotions and bring up support for the Nazi Party. But turning back to the American people, they were totally against intervening in another war. And a manifestation of this was the America First Committee. That it was composed of several hundred thousands of Americans, and as you pointed out in the last show, the public opinion polls were about as high as 80% against getting into another European war. And but as you also pointed out, and as we talked about, there were some people that were absolutely determined to circumvent the will of the American people. Now keep in mind that this is a representative democracy. The way the framers set things up is that it's the people themselves, through their elected representatives in Congress, who decide whether we're going to go to war or not. And that's the declaration of war requirement. So that's the way the system was set up. And so Franklin Roosevelt, who was determined to get the United States in the war, had to figure out a way to circumvent that constitutional provision. Now, as we've talked about in other shows, Roosevelt was already showing dictatorial tendencies, his court packing scheme in the 1930s, and his National Industrial Recovery Act. But here was his big challenge. Here he's facing 80% of the public that are against getting in the war. He himself is saying, I'm a non-interventionist. He's campaigning for the 1940 election. He's telling people, your boys will never be sent into another foreign war. And he's acting like he's one of them. But under the surface, he's making deals with Churchill. He's letting Churchill know that he's going to do whatever he can to come to Britain's aid. And so then he starts embarking on a course of conduct that is determined to circumvent the declaration of war requirement and the will of the American people. And from that point on, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes. Well, the 1930s was a strange period for a variety of reasons, all of which culminated in this tragic and terrible war. And the fact is, it is estimated by historians that as many as 50 million, that's 50 million people were killed in World War II. Now, of course, that includes both the Asian War, Japan, China, the United States, Britain, France, so far, and of course the European conflict. But at a minimum, 50 million people were the victims of that war. It's interesting to note that 1933 saw the rise of two centralizing governments. First, in Nazi Germany, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, by Hindenburg, the German president under the Weimar Republic. And he soon began concentrating power, control, and within a year he had transformed Germany basically into a virtually one-man dictatorship. He heavily used propaganda and means of mind control in terms of using radio, extravaganza parades, and public events. And on this side of the Atlantic, I want to make clear, I am not in any way saying that Franklin Roosevelt was like Adolf Hitler, but I'm talking about a trend of attitudes towards the role of government and a belief that it is the role of government to transform and influence public opinion. On this side of the Atlantic, FDR came to the presidency. In March of 1933, presidents were inaugurated back in March still then. And he instituted the New Deal, which itself involved a centralization of control and power through a variety of supposedly Great Depression crisis programs, many of which we've talked about in briefly, at least in some of the earlier sessions and then in earlier webinars that we've done. But the idea to use propaganda to mold public opinion, to arouse public support behind the government through a concentration and centralization of power, that was the template. And again, I want to emphasize, because I know sometimes people draw wrong conclusions about the classical liberal or libertarian critique of both domestic and foreign policies of the 1930s. Franklin Roosevelt was not a Nazi. Franklin Roosevelt was not a Mussolini fascist in the totalitarian sense. But there was sort of a spirit of the time, something in the air of a belief that the role of government needed to be more concentrated and centralized everywhere. In the United States, we had the Constitution, and that involved a different set of restraints and political philosophic attitudes, even on the part of someone like Roosevelt. But the fact is, there was this idea that government needed to be strong and powerful to direct and guide government. That was the template of the time of the 1930s. And that, I think, is not an unreasonable historical fact. Now, as the 1930s progressed, as you just said, Hitler played upon the had attempted to do. And that was basically to from ever being either certainly a military and even an economic major threat or power in Europe again. The Treaty of Versailles had limited the size of the German army. Hitler proceeded to circumscribe that. And one way he did this is that he was using secret treaties that had been set up under the Weimar Republic for German military units to train in the Soviet Union, to still have opportunities to develop war weapons clandestinely. As a result, the German military was built up again. And then he a brinksmanship game. He sent German troops into the Rhineland, and he renationalized borderland of the German territory bordering Holland, Belgium, and France, without a pip of resistance on the part of the French or the British. Then in 1938, he undertakes another adventure, and that is in March of 1938, again in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. He occupies Austria and annexes it. Under what banner? Well, Woodrow Wilson's national self-determination. The peoples who share a common language, a common culture, a common ethnicity should have the right to unify and be united in one nation state. The German people should have a right to be united. And he proceeded to annex Austria. And perversely reinforcing his rationale for this is that when a plebiscite was taken shortly after the German occupation, embarrassingly, the vast majority of Austrians actually voted for incorporation into Germany. The Nazis may have manipulated the election, but they didn't have to manipulate it very much. Then in later 1938, again under the idea of national self-determination and unification of peoples, he proceeds to demand those border regions of Czechoslovakia bordering on Germany that have predominantly German populations to be reunified with Germany, which led to the Munich Pact of September 1938. And therefore, approximately about 15% of Czechoslovakia was absorbed into Germany with British and French acquiescence. Then that continues. In March of 1939, he sends a military flotilla and occupies what's called Memeland, that had been first a League of Nations territory and then under Lithuanian control, which had been a German city, reunifying the German people again. More than people under one nation state. But then he made a mistake. And that mistake was to show his real colors. And that was not to limit himself under the dark cover of national self-determination to just unifying German people. And what he does is in March of 1939, he also proceeds to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. He makes the Czech provinces of Bohemia and Moravia German protectorates, and he proceeds to set up a puppet state in the eastern half of the country in Slovakia. Now he then proceeds to make demands on Poland. Now, were German-speaking areas transferred to Poland at the end of the First World War? Absolutely. To create what was known as the Polish corridor, so Poland had an outlet to the sea, a land outlet to the sea of the Baltic Sea, which separated Germany proper from the German province of East Prussia. But as a consequence of this, the British and the French now decide to give cover to the Poles, and they say that if Germany takes military action against Poland, they will come to Poland's defense, which of course is impossible, for the simple reason that the British and the French had no way to militarily come to the aid of the Poles, other than attacking Germany from the west. But they offered Poland, this guarantee. And the Poles used this guarantee as rationale to not negotiate with the Germans at all, even to try to see if there would be a compromise. Now, in retrospect, it's clear Hitler didn't want a compromise. He wanted to have an excuse to just grab all the territory and begin a war. But the fact is that this gave him the rationale, with the Poles refusing to negotiate at all, to set up their phony beginning of the war, where they instigate a border incident on the night of September 1, 1939, say that the Poles have attacked Germany, and then proceed to invade it. And then, because, as I believe we've talked about before, Germany's non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, that is with Stalin, on September 17th, the Soviet army invades Poland from the east. And before the end of September, all of Poland has been wiped off the map, with about half is under German permanent occupation, and the eastern half is annexed by Stalin into the Soviet Union. And what did the British and the French do? Well, they actually declare war, which from all historical accounts that I've read, shocked Hitler, because he thought they were paper tigers and they would cave into this as they had to both Austria and Czechoslovakia. But on September 3rd, the British and the French declare war on Germany. So now the Second World War begins in Europe. Now, again, just to remind the viewers, I apologize for this sort of chronological history lesson, but you have to understand the context. Then there's a phony war, and that phony war runs from basically October 1939 until April 1940, where the British and the French do nothing. They don't attack Germany. They have a few, some artillery shooting into German territory. They drop propaganda pamphlets on the German side of the border. And the Germans are just building up their strength on the West. It's called the phony war, until finally a real war breaks out in the West. In April of 1940, the Germans invade Denmark and Norway and occupy them in short order. And then on May 10th, 1940, the German army proceeds the attack on the West, that is Holland, Belgium, and France. And by the middle of June 1940, June 22nd actually, all of Holland, all of Belgium, Luxembourg, and with the French surrendering permanently now, that is during the war, about 2/3 of France are occupied by the Germans, with a collaborationist government in the rest of central and southern France called Vichy France. And Britain now stands alone. Churchill is determined that there's going to be no compromise with Hitler. He says that Britain will fight on alone. But the fact is, Britain has no way, no way, no way to do more than sit on their island and defiantly put up with a huge and destructive and deadly blitz, that is, the air attacks by the German Air Force. First on military targets, and that would be a different story, than civilian targets, including London and other cities. It is clear that Hitler now is the master of the European continent. The British cannot in any way remove him from his occupation of France or to dethrone him from Berlin. And that is why America becomes so important to the British survival and defeat of Hitler. Now, in that context, again, I apologize for the history lesson, but you have to understand this to understand America, American policy. In 1931, Japan had invaded Manchuria, the northeastern part of China, and set up a puppet state, Manchukuo. Then in July of 1937, the Japanese invaded the rest of China in the northeast and quickly occupied what Peking, but now known as Beijing, and up the Yangtze River, occupying Shanghai, and then what had been the nationalist capital of China, the pre-communist capital of China, Nanking. And the Chinese government has to withdraw up the Yangtze River to Sichuan province, way in the west to Chongqing. And it is clear that the Japanese now, while they're bogged down into an almost unwinnable war in mainland China, the Chinese will not surrender. They don't have the manpower to really, and the ability to defeat and occupy all of China. So they're in sort of a stalemate war in China. But it's clear that the Chinese government will never have the military power and ability on their own to drive the Japanese out. Now, and to give the viewers an idea, picture the United States, a map of the United States, and imagine that some foreign country occupied all of the United States east of the Mississippi. That's approximately the amount of territory that the Japanese occupied of the equivalent of China, and all of China's industrial and manufacturing and port cities. Anyway, so that explains sort of the picture of the setting in which Roosevelt now proceeds to follow a foreign policy.
All right, let's go back to, hang on a second. Before we get into Roosevelt, let's go back to what the Polish situation.
Right.
That Hitler was there attempting to negotiate with Poland over provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. And we
Right.
alluded to this last week when we talked about the city of Danzig, which was a German city and had always been part of Germany before World War I, but was separated from Germany as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. And then wasn't there an entire section of Germany that was taken away from Germany and given to Poland so that Poland could have access to the sea? Wasn't that what was called the Polish Corridor?
The Polish Corridor. Right,
and
right.
that consisted predominantly of German people, right?
Correct.
And so Hitler made a big deal of that when he was rising to power, and then there when all these crises were saying, he says, let's sit down and talk about this. So the people that were calling for a revision of the treaty in the 1930s, 1920s, like Maynard Keynes, they were the ones that turned out to be right, because if the treaty had been revised and had been made more in accordance with what should have been done, just principles and so forth, Hitler would have never been able to seize upon that as the excuse for invading Poland. And then, as you point out, the British are here issuing a guarantee to the Poles that says, if you get in a war with Germany, we will come to your assistance. Well, that empowered the Poles, which were really not this paragon of a free society either, to stand up to Hitler and refuse to negotiate in serious terms, because they figured, oh, well, we got the British behind us, why should we negotiate? And so this whole thing then cavalcades into war.
Exactly. But it is a fact that if the Poles had negotiated and if there had been some agreement about a transfer of territory, Danzig returned to German administration, some arrangements about this Polish corridor. Uh, in my estimation, from the reading of the events leading up to the Second World War. The fact is, if you read Mein Kampf, Hitler had determined that Germany's destiny, living room, Lebensraum, for Germany to be economically self-sufficient and as economically and politically as strong as any other major country in the world, Germany's destiny was to the east. Poland, large swaths of the Soviet Union, so even if the Poles had a compromise agreement equivalent to something like the Munich Pact of a year earlier, Hitler eventually would have made some other excuse to go to war. He was war driven. He believed that nations were made strong and self-sufficient and their races invincible through war. So it would have delayed what eventually would have still been through some set of events, a European war. But it is true that the war broke out at that time because the Poles, believing that they had the support of the British and the French, uh, could resist German demands, and by refusing to negotiate, even to delay what retrospectively was inevitable of a war, given Nazi ideology and Hitler's determination, the war was set going on September 1. And then the British and the French declared war, and that set the entire set of dominoes of the rest of the events in motion.
Yeah, I mean, once the Brits issue the guarantee, I mean, they could have violated the guarantee, but they wouldn't have looked too good. And as you point out, they really had no military capability to honor that guarantee at all. There was never any chance that they were going to free the Poles from the tyranny that the Nazis were putting them under. And yeah, I agree with you. I think there would have been war anyway because Hitler really perceived the Soviet Union the same way that the United States would perceive the Soviet Union in the Cold War after the war would end. He perceived the Soviet communist threat as a grave threat to Germany. And I think, Richard, he was always going to move east and initiate war against the Soviet Union. I mean, he considered communism the same way that the U.S. and the West considered communism after the war. I mean, part of the thing about World War II, and we'll get into that, was that the U.S. partners with the communist regime that would later become their official enemy in the Cold War. Well, this was Hitler's official enemy. And I agree with you. I think he would have ultimately gone to war against the Soviet Union regardless. But that's even an argument as to why Britain and France should have stayed out of the war. Let the two collectivist giants fight each other and weaken each other. That would have seems to me a better outlook. But we can look at that when we start examining the consequences of World War II. Over in the Pacific, one thing I think we ought to mention is the fact that the Japanese were desperately in need of oil, as any war machine is. Whenever it's out there occupying another country, invading countries, and that desperate need for oil certainly played a role in Roosevelt's later plan. So now let me turn it back again to you. You started to talk about what was happening then with Franklin Roosevelt.
Right. So in the middle of the 1930s, 1935, 36, 37, if I remember correctly, Congress had passed several neutrality acts precisely to not draw America into another European war because of the bad taste that had been left in people's mouths as a consequence of the First World War. These were not neutrality acts that were passed by Congress and signed into effect by Franklin Roosevelt himself. But in short order, he proceeded to violate these neutrality acts in a variety of ways. One of which was already in the 1930s, before any war broke out in Europe, was the fact that he ended up helping to set up and then fund what became known as the Flying Tigers in China. Maybe some of the older viewers and certainly the history buffs, will know that the Chinese did not have the air force or the air power to successfully combat the Japanese in the air. So supposedly this group of American pilots, some former military, others not, quote, volunteered to serve in the as an sort of an adjunct air force for the government of nationalist China, Chiang Kai-shek's government. And they became known as the Flying Tigers, led by a man named General Chennault. They were supposedly volunteers. The Chinese government was paying them a salary, providing the planes. The fact is, it has come out that the Flying Tigers was subsidized by the U.S. government. The U.S. government fostered and, in fact, helped recruit Americans to serve in the Chinese Air Force, and was paying the salaries of some of these people. So the fact already, even before war broke out in Europe, Roosevelt is doing this. Now, why is Roosevelt doing this? Well, he came to the conclusion early on that Japan was the threat to a peaceful Asia, and a country that would proceed to threaten not just world peace but unfairly treat China. Members of the Roosevelt family had been, quote, China traders in the 19th century. There was always sort of a sympathy and friendly attitude towards China compared to Japan in the Roosevelt family. And as a result, early on in the 1930s, he therefore is bolstering support for the Chinese government through these sort of shenanigans. Now, in Europe, the U.S. Once the war begins in Europe in 1939, and particularly after the fall of France, a series of secret exchanges. There's a special secret group of letters between Roosevelt and Churchill, the British Prime Minister, who was appointed to that position right after the German attack on Western Europe in May of 1940. He replaced Neville Chamberlain. They begin to have this private correspondence in which Churchill is persuading Roosevelt that the future of the world, the destiny of civilization, is dependent upon American support for the British war effort. And so they begin to undertake a series of basically extra-constitutional acts. Extra-constitutional, I mean, there is no declaration of war at this time. There are neutrality acts that have been signed. But what does the U.S. government? Well, one example of this was Lend-Lease. The British needed ships to serve in the convoys to travel across the Atlantic to bring war material that was being bought in the United States back to Great Britain. The Germans had an extremely effective and a deadly U-boat fleet, that is, submarine attack fleet in the Atlantic, and they were decimating the British fleets faster than they could replenish it. The British needed military vessels to serve as convoy protections for these fleets crossing the Atlantic for war material. Now, Roosevelt did not have authority to just give these mothballed military ships from the U.S. Navy to the British. He really couldn't sell them under the Neutrality Acts. So he then carried out this trick, which he sort of just came to in his deal with Churchill, that the British would lease British military bases in the Caribbean. Right? There's a lot of British colonies there, like Jamaica at the time and Trinidad and so on. The British would lease bases to the Americans in exchange for lending them these military U.S. Navy vessels that was supposedly had been mothballed. Some of them were not. And then the British could be able to have these convoy ships to help them bring supplies across the Atlantic. So that was undertaken. Roosevelt did this, famous example for the press, where he says, "Imagine that your friend, his house is burning down, and your neighbor's house is burning down, and it's right next to yours. And if the fire isn't put out, the fire may spread to your house. Is it unreasonable to lend your neighbor your water hose, right, your lawn hose, so he can put out the fire, so it's not threatening your property?" Uh, and so that was the type of rationale, and he refused to go into the constitutionality of this at all. He also was in 40 and in 1940, as we've talked about, he's running for re-election for an unprecedented third time. Nobody's done this before. And what is he running? On a peace campaign. He will keep America out of the war. As I satirized in a previous webinar, I've seen war. I hate war. I will never send American boys to fight on foreign shores. But of course, all the time that he's telling the American people this to get reelected for this unprecedented third term, he's in negotiations again with Churchill. The U.S. military is clandestinely having sessions with the British military on how to jointly set up operations, how they would stage joint strategies, all with the presumption that there's an inevitability of U.S. entry into the Second World War on the British side. One example of this was his meeting with Churchill off Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, age I forget, where they met and issued the Atlantic Charter. This was supposedly the unofficial joint war policy terms of the purpose of the British and the United States together. A world without war, a world without hunger, a world where there'll be peace for everyone. So this Atlantic Charter becomes sort of a mainstay. But the United States is entering into what is basically a political document about what is implicitly the diplomatic goal of a war effort, without the U.S. being in a war. And of course, Roosevelt in the media is praised by this, yes, the American idealism and so on. And he's just proceeding with all of these policies. Then the British are still having trouble convoying across the Atlantic Ocean. The war boats the U-boats, U-boats are decimating them. So now what does Roosevelt do? He occupies Iceland, which is a Danish territory at that time. And he proceeds, and Greenland, and he proceeds to then say that American naval vessels will go halfway across the Atlantic, convoying these merchant fleets to then be picked up by the British war vessels the rest of the way. Under what authority is he sending U.S. military vessels to be convoying British ships that have war-related material on board, which the Germans have said that's fair game for an attack on the high seas? And in fact, several times, the U.S. got into entanglements with U-boats. In fact, instigating chasing U-boats in the Atlantic, trying to track them and pinpoint them for the British air forces. And in fact, when the German U-boat commanders, a couple of times, finding themselves in this position, being dogged by destroyers of a neutral country, turned around and actually shot a couple of torpedoes without hitting any American vessels, Roosevelt says, yeah, I'm shocked. I'm shocked. The Germans have initiated war against the United States. All of these were part of this flimsy smokescreen of what was Roosevelt's determination to draw the United States into the Second World War through these extra-constitutional actions that had no basis in fact. Now, to just flip back to the Pacific, since it's all leading up to eventual Pearl Harbor now. In 1940, as France was falling in Europe in June of 1940, the Japanese invade and occupy French Indochina as a further attempt to envelop China under their control. French Indochina was made up of what today is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. So this was extending Japanese control to the southern border areas of China to be able to cut off supplies. Uh, what is Roosevelt's response to this? Shortly after this, he starts declaring embargoes against the Japanese. No selling of iron or scrap metal. Uh, a freezing of oil sales to the Japanese. And at the same time, the Dutch government that controls what today is Indonesia, then it was called the Dutch East Indies, which has a huge field of extractable oil. The U.S. government puts pressure on the Dutch government in exile to have the Dutch government in Indonesia to also impose an embargo of selling oil to the Japanese. As a consequence of this, the Japanese in the middle of 1940 find them 1941 in 1941 find themselves in the position of having oil supplies at home in Japan itself that would barely enable them to sustain their domestic needs and their war machine in China for at the most another 6 months. So the Japanese attempt to negotiate in various ways with the Roosevelt government to get out of this. But Roosevelt is adamant. He keeps saying there's only one basis upon which the United States will end these various trade and oil embargoes, and that is Japan's total and unequivocal withdrawal from all of China. Now, the Japanese are determined not to do that. The Japanese have it in their mind that they're merely doing what the British and French had done in the 19th century. Did not Britain and France go out to places in all of Africa practically and good parts of Asia and proceed to colonize them as the basis of resources and raw materials and living space for their peoples? Well, merely because Japan was not developed enough to do so at that time should not say that the Japanese should not be able to become a great colonial power with huge resources directly under their control from colonial occupation, the way the other colonial powers have done just a matter of half a century before they came onto the stage with the power to try to do this. So they accept this mentality that economic power is colonial empires, of which for them this is China. So the Japanese clearly were not going to just withdraw from this. And this now sets the stage finally for the events that occur in the fall of 1941, all of which will finally lead to the attack on Pearl Harbor itself on December 7th, 1941, at about 7:55 in the morning, Honolulu time.
Yeah, well, when you were talking about Poland and Germany, you indicated that the Germans concocted a fake attack from the Poles on Germany. And there was a reason for that. It's this time-honored philosophy that rulers have, even in dictatorial regimes, that they want to be perceived as the defender. They don't want to be perceived as the attacker. And so they come up with this lie of, oh, we've been attacked. We now have no choice but to defend ourselves against Poland. That's what Hitler did. Now, Roosevelt, his mindset was really no different. He knew he had 80% of the American people against him. He knew there was this huge organization called the America First Committee against him. And so he had to figure out a way where the other side would attack so that he could say, oh my gosh, we've been attacked. We have no choice now. That was the whole idea of convoying those ships. He was provoking the Germans. He kept taunting them and just daring them. Fire, blow up an American ship, and now I've got my cause to go and ask for the declaration of war. So he's willing to sacrifice innocent American men and women, if they were on these ships, for the sake of the greater good. And even Roosevelt apologists admit this today, that, oh, thank goodness he lied America into war and he was willing to sacrifice these innocent Americans. When that didn't work, Richard, he then goes into the Pacific, because the Germans wouldn't take his bait. They understood what he was trying to do. They didn't want war with the United States, along with the Soviet Union and Germany and France, and so they were not taking his bait. So he goes to the Pacific in what is now commonly called the back door to war, and he says, okay, I'll provoke the Japanese with this oil embargo, which really was an effective embargo. I mean, there really wasn't much of a free market where they could go out and buy oil from other people. The United States was strangulating them, strangulating them, and so the Japanese are being put in a bigger and bigger. They're being cornered by the oil embargo, and then Roosevelt comes and makes these humiliating negotiations where he's putting the Japanese into a humiliating position. And so he's setting the basis for, hey, we've been attacked, and he's really hoping that once the Japanese attack, that will then enable him to get into war in Europe and fulfill the commitments that he was secretly making to Churchill. I'd like to say one more thing, because we'll be discussing in later segments the consequences of war. That keep in mind that the guarantee that the British had made to Poland was that they would be freed from Nazi tyranny. That's an important point when we start looking at consequences at the end of the war. Same thing with China, that Roosevelt apologists have said, oh no, he was just acting innocently, trying to protect the people of China. He wanted to free them from Japanese tyranny. We'll be looking at the results of that effort as well. And one final thing I should mention is with respect to the Jews, and maybe we should explore this a little bit further, that in the 1930s, the fact was that Germany, Nazi Germany, Hitler was willing to let a lot of the Jews go, the German Jews. And that the problem was that not one Western country, not one country was willing to let them come in, including the United States under the Franklin Roosevelt administration. This was under the guise of immigration controls. Oh, we have quotas. And we'll look at the results of World War II from that perspective as well. So, Richard, we're a little bit past time. I figure we ought to wrap it up at this point, and enjoy the show as always, and we'll see our viewers next week.
Until next time.
Okay, thank you, and we'll see you next week.